So one of the miracles of today is that we have managed to stay on time. Um, and so I think we'll probably have a few stragglers coming in, but um, we've had an amazing day of hearing from people who run our elections, people who study our elections, people who are engaging in our elections and leaders in our communities. So we thought we end the day with something completely different. And Elamin Abelmahmoud brings, I think, is a unique voice in Canada, bringing his intersection of deep knowledge and appreciation and love for culture and pop culture and everything culture, and a deep love and appreciation for our political world. And so if you're not familiar with his work, he is now every day, right, on CBC, including today, coming from running a show, Commotion, looking at culture and everything culture, but he's also been on politics and power and politics. No, it's not power. Yeah, that issue. Yes, that issue. Thank you. Thank you. And so it's been a long day for me too. So apologize. And if that's not enough, he has written an incredible memoir called Son of Elsewhere that was named by the New York Times as one of the 100 books you should be reading. I would put it in my top 10 books of you should be reading. But all these pieces he weaves together because, as much as we are all committed to the world of politics and democracy and strengthening it, and we've had a great turnout. There were 50,000 people in Rogers Stadium on Saturday night at Ed Sheeran. So we cannot compete with culture. Culture is going to be part of this story and needs to be part of this story. And so that's why I am incredibly grateful that Elamin is joining us to share his insights and his perspective on what this means to build a vibrant and inclusive democracy in Canada. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Thanks, John. You certainly can compete with Ed Sheeran, by the way. You just got to write a song like Shape of You, and it's that simple. Hi, everyone. My name is Elamin Abelmahmoud. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to be with you while you've had this lengthy day together. I'm hoping that there's like a bit of like loopy energy in the room. That's when I do my best work. In case we've never met before, in case you don't know me at all, I'm a husband, I'm a dad, I'm a lover, I'm a sinner. The Meredith Brooks song, you know that one. I'm trying to get out of the habit of introducing myself through the thing that I do for a living. But in case you're wondering what I do for a living, I'm professionally a Swiftie. And then the thing that pays the bills, I suppose, is I host a daily radio show on CBC called Commotion. It is an arts and pop culture show every day on the radio at 11 a.m. It's a bit of an odd thing for me to be doing because before that, sort of had a career as a culture writer, had a career as a political commentator, and now I have to a little bit pretend like I don't know anything about politics. So anything I say, keep it a secret. Okay, I know nothing at all. I'm excited to be talking to you guys. I'm excited to be here because thinking about democracy to me is thinking a little bit about story. Sometimes I'm going to refer to my notes here. If I do, please don't mind me. So I wanted to start this talk by saying about 7 or 8 years ago, I worked for TVO. TVO, you guys know what TVO is? Good. Shout out TVO. And at TVO, one of my jobs there was to sort of be an assistant producer on this education series. This education series that was called "What Do We Need to Know in Common?" It's an education series that they did at the University of Waterloo, and the whole point of it was to talk about curriculum, to talk about how is the curriculum going to change in the next few years, and as it changes, how do we navigate this fundamental question of what do we need to know in common? And increasingly, as we were sort of producing the series, this larger question popped out at me. And it's a question that has animated my work ever since. And it's a question of what do we need to know in common in order for us to be a we at all? That is not an easy question. It's not an easy sort of simple question to tackle because the things we do together are the things that make us a we, right? Just because we share the space doesn't immediately suggest to all of us that we are a we. Point of origin doesn't necessarily suggest some kind of coherent identity. That we all like one thing doesn't suggest necessarily enough of a coherent identity. There has to be something a little bit deeper than that. It has to be something a little bit deeper that gets at this notion of what a we is. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about this question that's animated my work. What are the threads that connect all of us and ground us in this sort of shared we together? And when you start to untangle those, it tends to be story. That's, to me, the thing that engages all of us fundamentally. Not just story, right? But something even deeper than that, which is engagement in a story. So I'll tell you this thing that just happened on Friday. I was walking to a conference Friday afternoon, and as I was walking in, it was on the campus of Mohawk College in Hamilton. And this person was like, "Hey, do you go to school here?" I said, "That's flattering. No, I have too much gray hair." So I said, "No, I don't go here." She was looking for basically help with like the parking. And she said, "What are you doing here?" And I was like, that's a bit forward of you, but I'm here for a conference. And then she said, "On what?" And I was like, "Lady, too many questions." But so the answer that I gave her is like, there's a conference going on. It's about anti-racism. We're here to have a conversation about it. And then she said, "Interesting. I didn't know there was racism in Canada." Okay. The way that I know you guys are all a shared we of sort is you had that response, right? You are engaged in a particular story and what it means to live in this country. She's engaged in a different one. In her conception, her story, her construction of what Canada is, she's legitimately just has not, we got into it a little bit. She's legitimately just not had a chance to process the idea that there is racism to be talked about in Canada. To me, like that's not an offensive notion. It's a curious one, right? Because suddenly our stories have diverged. We occupy the same country, we occupy the same democratic system, but we have been told and we have processed entirely different stories about that place that we live. That's really interesting to me. So as we got a little bit deeper into this, it sort of becomes clear to me that that is the thing that divides so many people. It's like we just exist in different stories. You guys just had that session on disinformation earlier today. Disinformation does that, right? It literally creates different universes. Even though the news is the same, the interpretations and the stories that are created around those news stories, they end up believing somewhere else. But the reason I want to have a conversation about this is because I have naturally been kind of curious about story for some time. Story is something that for me has kind of popped up when I moved to this country. So I moved to Canada when I was 12 years old. I moved to Canada when I was 12 from Sudan. I didn't speak English at all. And I moved to a town called Kingston, Ontario, which is 2.5 hours east of here. Kingston is, what's a polite way of putting it? Love that. It's fantastic. Kingston is a wildly white town. I think that's the polite way of putting it. And it sort of meant moving into that conception of what Canada is. So this suddenly became my introduction to this place. And within that conception, within that introduction to what Canada is, I sort of had to navigate and get interested in the thing that other people are interested in. And by this, I mean, run this thought experiment in your life any day of the week. It will work out 10 out of 10 times. Have you ever walked into a party and said, boy, you guys want to talk about the Bank of Canada interest rate? It doesn't fucking work. It doesn't work. It's not the thing that people want to talk about, but people are engaged in the pop culture stories that they're engaged in all the time. It has one of the earliest things in my life that I sort of figured out naturally was that people want to talk about pop culture. People want to talk about the art that they're consuming, but the ways that it's shaping their life. And I learned this because my first initial curiosity in this country was just sitting by the radio and trying to understand not what is popular. I didn't even know what was happening on the radio, but I wanted to understand why the thing that was popular was popular. Why is this the thing and not many of the other millions of things? Why is this lady who's singing about being like a bird so popular with everybody? What does that mean? It's a metaphor. I get it now. But my point is trying to sort of connect with that idea, trying to connect with this idea of this thing is popular because it connects other people. People are motivated and interested in this thing. That became my first initial curiosity. I'm very lucky to get to do that for a living now. Very lucky to get to go on the radio or write about things that are connecting with people and talk about, hey, why is this the thing? Why is, out of all the things that could be connecting, why is this the thing? And what that's made me realize is that I don't think for as much storytelling we do about the pop culture we're interested in, the moments of pop culture we're in, the way that we give trends names, the way that we give certain ideas that are becoming more dominant as like a name, the notion of quiet quitting, like that's like a pop culture idea to me, because a news story becomes a pop culture item when it creates chatter. It creates enough energy that people are like, oh, I want to talk about it. You might go to a party and talk about quiet quitting. Don't invite me to those parties. But the real point, though, is that there's something about the way the pop culture opens doors to other people. And I started thinking about how we engage with democracy, not as a story. Or if we do engage with it as a story, I don't think we say that those elements of the story out loud, or at least not very often. What does it mean for us to be engaging with democracy as a story? And so I started thinking about, okay, I understand my relationship to democracy. But if I had to explain that to someone who's never had to think about that, what are the tools, right? What are the tools of story that I'm going to draw upon? Not a lot of suspense there, right? Not a lot of mystery. There tends to be a lot of defeatism. There tends to be a lot of cynicism about democracy because we're not reinventing it every day. That is not something that we are doing. So the novelty is not brought into it. And when I started thinking about how would I explain my interactions with democracy, the easiest thing to do is to talk about voting, right? The easiest thing to do is like voting is when democracy pops up. But then I started thinking about my dad. Okay, so my dad lives in Kingston, volunteers on the board of the Islamic Society of Kingston, has done so for some time. On top of doing that, when we had an influx of refugees coming in every single time, my dad is the first person to put his hand up, not to organize some kind of macro effort. It's literally him just saying, who needs to be driven where? I have a car. It's the first thing that he does, is say, I can't do a lot, but the first thing I can do is drive people around. Sometimes that means when new immigrants are arriving in Kingston and they're overwhelmed and they don't know what to do, he's the first person to say, well, I don't really know a lot about how to navigate the system. And then he's still able to point out all the first 10 steps that someone needs to take to navigate the system, because to him, it's experience that he has gained that he doesn't really know to name. And even now, if he was sitting in this room, he wouldn't be like, I'm skilled at these things. And I have to be like, Dad, this is a skill set that you built up over time, over repetition, over dozens and dozens of times of doing this with people. And that's a better story, right? That's a better story when we think about what democracy is in the ways that it touches your life, is that you get to participate in other people's lives. There's something deeply fundamental about the notion of democracy that is at its core. It's about this notion of taking other people's problems, making them your problems, right? That is what we're doing here. In whatever capacity of democracy, that is the thing that we are doing here. This, at its very core, it's this training and this ability to sort of constantly say, I see that that is a problem, and I'm willing to make it my problem. How do I do that? I wanted to talk about that because as I sit here, one thing that I've been struggling with is right now in Sudan, my people are not doing well. And by that, I mean like the state has collapsed over the last 2 months, 3 months. No one knows when the chaos is going to end. And I'm contrasting that with 2019. So in 2019, the Bashir government fell after he was in power for 30 years or so. And I watched from here as my cousins, and I have like 1 billion of them, they're all there. My cousins sort of engaged in this revolution. I watched them every day on Facebook, on WhatsApp, on Instagram, showing up every day, just simply putting their bodies somewhere, saying, I can't really do much except for be with other people. But we can be together, we can sit here, and this is the way that we're going to influence change in the place that we live. And sure enough, they won. No one thought that they were going to win. Even then, even in 2019, when this was happening, the mood wasn't that they were going to win. The mood was that they had to do this because they had no other option. And they get the victory. I am 35 years old. Bashir at that point had been in power, had been alive for 31 years, and he'd been in power for 30 of those years. So since a little bit before I turned 1, that's how long Bashir has been in power. And the feeling that set in was a disconnectedness for me. One, disconnectedness from my cousins, right? They're able to participate in this movement. They're able to sort of be there in this moment. I don't know how to be there for them in this moment. I don't know how to be an active participant in this moment. But then I started thinking about what would it mean for a sizable movement to take place here? Not about the same things, not motivated by the same things, but if you were to rally a sufficient number of people who would make you feel like you're missing out because everyone else is participating in this movement, what would that look like? What is that kind of democratic expression? And I obviously couldn't come up with one. We don't have an analogy for that here. Probably because our situation is not acute, but also I think because we've trained ourselves in honestly very mundane ways to think of our stories as our own, right? To think of our stories as like largely you are your own self and you're responsible for yourself. And there's a really difficult training that we have to overcome to weave our story with other people, weave our story with others in order to understand this notion that like, you know what? I am someone who's going to take your problem and make it my problem. That is a muscle that we have to train. It is not a muscle that I'm particularly good at. And as I was listening to my cousins talk about it, I was listening to my dad explain to me what my cousins were doing in Sudan. What became very clear to me very early on is that I actually had the blueprint for this when I was young, because I had an uncle who would quite often tell the history of democracy. It's quite something. And the way that he would do it is he would always talk about it in the flow of things as though this is what happens when people come together. That is it. That is the way that he made that story so engaging to me. First time I went to jail, never been to jail aside from the one time. I was 4 years old. I was 4 years old. And we were visiting my uncle in a Sudanese jail because he was the secretary of the Communist Party of Sudan during a moment in time when all the political parties were banned. So Bashir comes into power in 1989. He bans all the political parties by the end of 91. My uncle is in jail by the beginning of 93. And we went to visit him, right? We went to visit my uncle in jail. We walk in and we spend the visiting time, and I, being a very young child, had not yet turned 5. And I didn't want to leave. The visiting hours are over. And so I don't remember the story, but this is the way that's been relayed to me is that apparently one of the security guards was like a little gruff with my dad, trying to be like, you guys need to leave now. And I wouldn't leave again because I'm 4. And my dad basically said to the security guard, hey, don't be mean to my kid. And the security guard was like, all right, I'll put you both in a cell. And apparently they put us in there for 25 minutes. So, but when that is kind of your origin point of interacting with what democracy is, an uncle who cares so deeply about developing your understanding of what democracy is, and then also the contrast of a prison guard who's willing to just be like, you know what, I'm going to put them both in prison. It does form your relationship to other people. It does form your idea of like, you know what, I'd like to be a little bit more engaged in other people's problems. I started returning to the teachings of my uncles recently, and I started returning to this idea that we all owe each other something. We all owe each other the presence of each other. And the way that I do that now is through this idea of telling story. I'm trying to figure out, right? I'm trying to figure out how do I bring you into a story that you don't feel like you belong in. I think that is a little bit of the work that you guys are going to do. I think we're going to have a bit more of a conversation about that with Farah in a minute. But I want to just return to this point, right? Return to this point of all the time we're engaged in some kind of story construction. Sometimes you're aware of it, sometimes you're not aware of it. Can be so deeply disappointing to a person when you realize that you've been engaged in a story construction that leaves people out, that is really limited in worldview. My career has been about trying to figure out, you know what? Where are the places where I have limited my own story? Where are the places where I have failed my own story? I'm trying to do better with that. I want to talk to you guys about that, but I'm going to leave it here and talk to Farah. Let's do it. Yeah.
Ask my kids, I could certainly yell. Yeah. Just gonna go over here and grab my phone so we have it for time. We okay? You have a side? No side? Oh, yeah, good. Okay. That was terrific, everyone. Elamin, Abelmahmoud. I was really riveted by what you were saying. Maybe we start with when you're talking about stories, right? There's so many different stories out there right now that are not true. There's so much misinformation, disinformation. We talked about that. Is that one of the reasons that you think engaging in democracy right now is so important? What else do you think is the reason that we're seeing this fragility in so many places in the world?
Yeah, I think there's something about that increasing fragility. Like, I'm too young to be like, I remember that it was better when I was younger. You know what I mean? Like I'm 35 years old, but I remember particularly the internet being a kinder place. And by kinder place, I mean like just a more hospitable place to engagement with other people. Something seems to have really shifted in the last 8, 9 years or so, where combination of the way the internet is governed and the way that the information travels around the internet, where it's become genuinely, you know, hostile in terms of promoting and actually maintaining our links to each other, right? You talked about disinformation and the idea that there's so many news stories that are not true that are circulating. I remember when I was working at BuzzFeed News, and my colleague Craig Silverman was one of the first people who sort of started tracking fake news and disinformation. And I was always curious about how bad could this really get? And I think even then, not enough of us understood how bad it could get, because little by little over time, the links between us get just like a little bit more and more destroyed. So the stakes are high. Like the stakes are really, really high, which is to say, like if you're going to be engaged in protecting democracy now, that has to be one of the places that you start.
Is it too simplistic to say things changed after Trump, after Kellyanne Conway talked about alternative facts? Like, is that too simplistic, or do you think that was when it happened? That's when the
I mean, it really feels like it was overnight. You know, it was in 2016, 2015, 2016. There was like a comical tone to the way that CNN was covering Trump's lies. It was kind of like funny, you know, they had like a lie count, you know. But also at the time they were doing this thing where they were broadcasting his rallies nonstop. It was, if he was on stage for 2.5 hours, 3 hours, it'd be like put the camera on him. What bad could this possibly lead to? And one of the big learnings of 2016 is like, you actually just can't do that, because you can't just give too large a platform to a single figure. It is, I don't think it's, I think people are too hesitant to say like this began with Trump. Of course it did. Of course it, like that's how it migrated to the mainstream. I'm not saying there was no disinformation before that. You know, I stood in the grocery line and also rolled my eyes at the National Enquirer. You know what I mean? Like that was like something that we all did. But it sort of went professional. It went mainstream in ways that I think we should not be too shy to be like, that's clearly when it sort of got much worse.
Well, we have the election there in 2024. I don't know when ours is going to be, but are you concerned that that's creeping up here? And has it crept up here?
I think we've seen elements of it, of course. I think when every report that came out, every reporter that was reporting on the convoy, for example, there would be like some element of when the reporting on the convoy of 2022 was happening, of like, and here's also some of the elements of disinformation that some of the people who are encountering also believe. And there's, I think, a danger to that. There's a danger to just kind of repeating the disinformation that some people are saying. You know, we still haven't quite figured out what the best practices are of dealing with disinformation in that way. I think there is, but it's becoming more urgent. It's becoming more urgent because it can have these large platforms.
What do pop culture trends tell us about the state of our democracy?
Do you guys watch Succession? Good. I think about Succession a lot, man. I think about Succession because it was a show that very slowly but very perfectly sort of laid out the social ills that very naturally lead to the deterioration of democracy, to the point where, so when this last season came out, I'm going to try not to spoil stuff. Sorry, I'm going to do it, man. I'm going to do it a little. Fine. Jesse Armstrong, the creator of Succession, said the most shocking episode of the 4th season is episode 8. I won't tell you what happens in episode 8, but it is shocking, truly, how casually democracy can be undermined in one single setting, in one single room. But there was something really magical about the way that show kind of portrayed it, to the way that like people, I saw so many think pieces, so many people sort of writing about the show, writing about the ways that it kind of exposes to how power can make decisions, and then just like in a split second, without spoiling anything, in a split second, in the entire democratic system is it's really hard not to spoil this. The entire democratic system is undermined in ways that are so deeply consequential, and the people didn't seem to care. But what was interesting to me was the way that people were responding to Succession as though it was a documentary, right? Like, this is a perfectly scripted show, but there's something about it that feels so true, right? There's something about the show that feels so correct in terms of the way that it captured how power moves and how information moves, that people had like this really strong reaction. So when I think about Succession, I think I'm kind of heartened by the way that people are really willing to engage with like deeply political moments, deeply political consequences, because a show like Succession makes them sort of, they didn't even put them up front and center. What's up front and center is like the ridiculous drama of these awful people. But no one was blind to like the way that they're causing damage. I didn't spoil it.
You know, it's so funny. I watched maybe the first 2 episodes and I just hated everybody so much. And I
Yeah.
felt like if I can't even root for one character, I can't watch the show.
That doesn't get better.
I couldn't stand them.
They get so much worse. Like
God, but maybe for this exercise and understanding democracy, maybe watch it again. I don't know.
They truly get much more despicable than they did in the first couple episodes.
That's terrible. That's terrible.
And Kendall maybe murdered a guy in the first season. He got worse. I don't understand how he got worse.
Oh boy. Oh,
that wasn't a spoiler. That's first season. That's 5 years ago, you know?
Now, when we're looking at trends in pop culture and we think about, I know in your book you talk about how you know your first foray into wrestling and how that kind of got you interested in so many different things and opened the door for your writing and that kind of thing. But for young people who are expressing themselves through pop culture, connecting through pop culture, what are we seeing in terms of the way the future is as it relates to democracy, as it relates to misinformation? Are there any ties there?
I mean, particularly the channels, the avenues of where people are consuming information. I am constantly straddling the line between being alarmed and being heartened that people find news on TikTok. And like, I'm not saying that dismissively. I'm a very heavy TikTok user. I use TikTok a lot. It is not a good news source. It's not built to be a good news source, you know? And there are certainly news accounts. Washington Post is very good at using TikTok. Torrance Star is pretty good at using TikTok. But it's fundamentally not the kind of platform that is engineered to be like, here's normal information, you know, that you might need in your day-to-day life, and here's how it should be spread. And so I know there's a lot of conversations happening about this, but when I think about the spaces that are best optimized to spread little pop culture trends, also getting in the business, not even getting in the business, sort of as a byproduct, also spreading news somewhat. I think that worries me because we moved from Facebook, which is a place that's like, you know what, it is just kind of built to spread information. That's not a bad thing. I think it's, you know, I think it could be better at policing itself, obviously. I'm a incredibly heavy Twitter user, you know, that's my fucking problem though. But Twitter is also like, Twitter's the most effective platform at spreading news. It's so current. TikTok isn't like that. TikTok is sort of engineered to be an entertainment platform. And so I try not to like worry too much about where news is headed in that way. But the idea that like, this is you sort of get all these news stories. It's very common for someone to be like, I heard about that thing. I'm going to look for more information about it. But they don't type it into like the Google search bar. They type it into the TikTok search bar. Well, that's going to lead you in a place that I don't know where that's going. I don't know where that's going to lead you. And so I would say we just have to have more conversations about how, you know, about how to govern that.
When you look at that, I mean, it's funny you were mentioning Twitter because you're one of the like OG Twitter users. You have had so many followers for so long.
You say that, and I feel shame.
Why? You feel shame?
Shame. Yeah, it's not.
I mean,
not
look,
a badge of honor, man.
No, but remember when Twitter was. That's how I got introduced to you through your Twitter account. But it's changed that platform, right?
Sure has.
Has your relationship with it changed? Do you feel a little bit different? now about Twitter?
You know what? I'm less likely to share like a well thought out thing on Twitter. Like, and I mean that because for like a little while, it just kind of became a place of bad faith engagement. You know, I'm very fortunate to have mostly like have a community of people who don't really do that, but every once in a while, we'll like tweeting about a particularly current news topic. Like the risk you run is someone else who's searching for people to fight with. They're going to come and show up at you, you know, and fight you, you know, fight your tweet. And that's just an exhausting way to live. So I now mostly tweet like dad jokes. And they're not funny. I'm really sorry. But because it's easier to be that. It's easier to do that. But as I've done that, you know, my wife has sort of noted, she's like, you become like a little bit more cynical in your engagement. And her point, I'm trying to think about this and process it because she's usually right about these things, and I don't like that she's right about these things. But she's like, you become a little bit cynical when you're not engaging in the conversation, like the political conversations, because you, at heart, you're just kind of built to sort of talk to people about these things, figure out like how people are feeling about it, and maybe like to say, you know, I don't really agree with where you're coming from, but this is where I stand. But that's like the Twitter of like 2010, you know.
Exactly.
And we used to do that so much, and it's just kind of felt so much more challenging to do that in recent years. But the problem is when you get out of that muscle, you get out of the stream of like just literally tolerating another person's opinion, you know. That is a muscle. That is a muscle that is kind of collectively weakened, you know. And that's a thing to be concerned about.
You know, John talked about this today when we opened our discussions this morning, and it was, you know, listening to the other side, right? Like like listening to understand rather than listening to refute or to argue with somebody. And you know, you mentioned that that woman who talked to you and said, you know, there's racism in Canada, you know. And how do you do that? Because that's a lot easier to say, or to say, you know, I'm gonna give this an effort. But to do it is a whole different thing. You almost have to put down your vulnerability. Like you just have to be raw a little bit to understand. How do you do that?
I think there's an element of like you got to stop listening in order to brand a person. I think sometimes you can sort of notice it in conversation. Sometimes, like as someone is explaining their position on something, you see the other person doing the calculus of like trying to put them in a bucket of some sort. Right? Like, what kind of person are you? Like, where are these beliefs coming from? Is there like a label for this? Because you can fight with a label, you can't fight with a person. You know, you're not supposed to fight with a person. It's much easier to fight with a label. I think in terms of the way of creating room for different stories, different conceptions of a story that you have, is it has to do with capacity, right? You don't always have the capacity. Not everybody always has the capacity to be like, yeah, I can engage with this thought. Yeah, I can be here and sort of listen to you tell me this and then be like, okay, I come at this from a different perspective. Some days you're going to be up for it. And some days you're not. On the days you're not, you should honor that. But on the days you are, you should also honor that and be like, you know what, I will open this can of worms. I will get in the habit of becoming a little bit uncomfortable, because just because we disagree on something doesn't mean that this has to be the end of the conversation. In fact, it's kind of the start of one. Yeah.
So I'm just going to check the time because
course.
the last session I moderated, I went over. So okay. The one question I have about that is, so you're talking about at the individual level, right?
Yeah.
When we talk about polarization, it's kind of at a societal level, right? Of people not. So how do you bridge that gap? And one, and two, and I know that's a huge loaded question, but the second question is art, pop culture, that's something that brings people together. Music, it brings people together, right? Like you can't. So is there a way through pop culture to kind of bridge that?
You watched Yellowstone?
I know another one I don't watch.
Do you guys watch Yellowstone?
Anybody Yellowstone? Yeah. Oh,
A few of you. It's interesting. Do you like Yellowstone? Yeah, that's fair. I'll tell you what Yellowstone is. Yellowstone is Succession on a ranch, right?
Oh,
So Yellowstone is a story of John Dutton, who's had this ranch in his family for 7 generations. And he's like, I don't know which of my idiot children to entrust it with for the next generation. It's succession on a ranch. And John Dutton's played by Kevin Costner. We're in the 5th season now. And what's interesting about Succession is that it is the #1 show in America, but no one's writing about it. Like you don't get a lot of written pieces about Succession,
that's exactly
but
Yellowstone.
Yellowstone. You don't get a lot of it. Like it has something like 8 times the audience that a Succession episode is going to get because Yellowstone is so wildly popular. But what's interesting is that Yellowstone is kind of like a Rorschach test for your politics, right? You can read it and go, this is clearly and demonstrably a story of a conservative family that is trying to maintain power, that is trying to consolidate power among themselves. The Duttons do a lot of bad things to protect their land. They kill so many people to protect their lands. They try to, pull on the levers of government quite a few times to protect their lands, including inexplicably in the 5th season, John Dutton is the fucking governor, all to protect his ranch. It's insane. But there's also this reading, right, of Yellowstone as an anarcho-environmentalist show. The show that is about a family that is like the invading forces are clearly capitalist. And that is not the thing we're interested in. The only thing we're interested in is the integrity of the land and the integrity of protecting it from these people who want to invade and create resorts, and these people who want to, invade and create an airport and hotels, and in many ways kind of damage it. But when you get into the numbers, what's interesting is everybody's watching Yellowstone, regardless of political stripe. I'm not saying that Yellowstone is the answer to polarization, by the way. I would never be so ambitious. But I would say that, like, when you have a story that is real, right, which is to say, there are real stories of ranchers and farmland who are dealing with being dispossessed, potentially dispossessed, of the space that they occupy. It actually just transcends these really neat lines, these really neat political lines. Of, well, you have this kind of profile, so you belong here. You have this kind of profile, you belong here. And so, to me, like that's like a return to this idea of story again. Of if you craft a story correctly, it can include everybody, and in fact, it can make people go, "I don't understand how you read the show in this way. It's clearly this kind of show." Like there are all-out battles of people being like, hey, Yellowstone is a conservative show. No, you're being very dumb. Yellowstone is clearly a liberal show. And they sort of have these sort of battles of values. And I think to me, what that tells me actually is that like there are elements of story that you can sort of turn up and tweak so that it gets people really worked up in one direction or the other. But also you can do that in service of bringing people together, right? In service of, we can tell the story elegantly enough that it does cross these lines or gets people animated in these ways, gets people engaged in some of these stories. I'm very sorry to answer your polarization question about Yellowstone. It's just that
no, that's kind of what I want. I want to understand. Yeah.
I don't get enough opportunities to talk about Yellowstone. That's the other thing.
I clearly need to watch more TV. That's really interesting. I guess when it comes to pop culture, we're also seeing, because I mean, do your listeners skew younger, you think, or no? It's CBC radio. I mean,
well, it's radio, so radio does not skew younger.
Right.
It's radio. However, we also I don't think of myself as someone who hosts a radio show. I think of myself as someone who hosts a podcast that is recorded live. So it's kind of like it's a little bit tough.
Yeah. So I guess when we look at the state of elections and we look at right now maybe the ebb of voter turnout, for example. What is a way to maybe use pop culture, maybe not? How do we get people more engaged in our democracy?
The stories we tell in between elections have higher stakes than the ones that we do tell during elections. I've never really understood that. There's something about election time that tends to bring out conversations that are deeply managerial, like deeply about sort of intricacies of policy design, intricacies of like, you know, I guess like the simplest way to talk about this is, for example, like the Canada child benefit and how that's like affected a certain number of people. I don't think we are in enough practice, particularly in this country, in telling a story, a narrative of what you want this country to be during election period. I think we do that a lot in between elections, actually. Like politicians tend to do that a lot in between elections, but when it comes to election time,
It's more the
it's just more.
Yeah.
And maybe the nitty gritty is because of us. Is because like they want to give the media something to hold on to be like, all right, what are the policy planks? What are you hanging your hat on? And you get it because like that's the thing that's going to get a reporter's attention. But maybe we need to sort of start asking the question of, okay, what kind of story do you want to tell of this country? Or what kind of story do you want to tell of this country's future in the next 10 years? And I think that can get people engaged in, but also I'm not assuming to have solved the engagement problem simply with that answer. I just mean, to me, that's what I'm looking for. And it's the thing that I get the least specifically during election. I get all of that in between elections, but I think you so rarely get that when it is actual election period.
I'm curious, do you remember your first election here in Canada?
No. Yes, I do. It was a provincial election.
Right.
Yeah.
And what were your, I don't know how involved you were before 12 in Sudan, but what was it like? What was that experience like for you?
Here?
Yeah.
Honestly, it was not, it was one of those things where I was told that we've had this MPP for a long time and that is not going to change with this particular election. And so I was told this story, this idea that like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you vote because Kingston will always vote in this one particular way. And that at the time made me think, well, I guess I don't really need to get involved in this thing. I remember voting, but I don't remember feeling like this really matters. And it's because we have somewhat of a defeatist kind of approach to talking about the incumbency effect. I think like we maybe need to detach ourselves from that like kind of cynical kind of defeatism.
Interesting. It's probably good to leave our audience with some hope as we do at the end of some good shows that you should be watching, but also some hope. What gives you hope? When you look forward towards, you're a dad now, when you look forward in terms of how the world is being shaped and our democracy and and the less and less democracies that we see all over the country, all over the world, sorry. What gives you hope?
I have a 6-year-old daughter, and she's like me in ways that truly terrify me. Parenting is like looking at the worst mirror of yourself, man. Because I go, those are all the things I meant to fix about me, but I didn't get a chance to do that, and now you have them. But one thing that I think I got right is that she is the toughest negotiator I've ever met in my life. I'll give you an example of this. We're going to talk about bedtime for a moment. Okay, so my daughter, true story, every day will get into this negotiation thing like she's like in some kind of auction. She's like, hey, can we do 20 books at bedtime? And I go, no, are you crazy? We can do 3, and she'd be like, give it to you for 15, and I go, no, we can still do 3. Well, and she keeps kind of going down in numbers, and then eventually she'll get to a number that is still preposterously high, like 9 or something. And I'll say, I've read the books. I know how to hold the boundary and say, we're doing 3 bedtime books. But she's gone to this habit now where she holds my face very gently in her hands. And she goes, Baba, I know that your parents said no to you a lot. You don't want to be like your... She says that, and she says, you don't want to be like your parents, do you? And then we do 7 books. It is it is deeply effective. Because she's right, because she's completely right about that.
She
But
needs to run for office.
I repeat, she's 6 years old. She's going to become a problem later in the future. But I just wanted to share that story. But the thing that really gives me hope is her sureness of what she wants, you know? And I'm in this place where I talk with other parents about how they're parenting. You guys read a lot about gentle parenting? Gentle parenting is a plague upon all of us, but also I'm gentle parenting. And part of what it means is like watching a young generation of kids who are growing up just being like, yeah, you can do what you want. What does that look like? Instead of whatever it is that we grew up with. And I'm really just curious to see what happens when that generation gets to a place where they can vote, gets to a place where they can influence the world. Because if they can manage to hold on to like these tenets of gentle parenting, of just creating space for being like, you can feel the thing you want to feel, and then also after that, be empowered to change it. I don't know, man. These kids are built different. And I say this as the parent of one. And so I'm curious about that. I'm curious about what happens literally in 12 years when this child is able to vote. Watch out. It's going to be a problem.
Yeah.
She's going to negotiate for 20 books every fucking day.
And that's it.
Yeah.
It's interesting. No, it's in my house too. It's much more democratic. Like I grew up in a dictatorship, and now it's like I have like a democracy in my house. Like it's always we're talking about how everybody gets kind of a chance to say how they feel and how we have discussions and debates, and very different.
Training them to be heard from when they're young. Like, what is this?
Yeah.
Who gives them the right?
Yeah.
We did. Yeah.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, it is a new approach. And that's, I never thought about it that way, but you're right. It's hopefully a bright future, or we've just all messed up. I don't know.
Gonna be great. Gonna be great.
All right. Elamin, Elamin Abelmahmoud, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you. And the book is out there. You should all pick it up and read it. And there's some wrestling stories in there that are hilarious. So
thank you.
Yeah. So thank you again for doing this. And I think it was a great way to close out our first day of the summit.
Thank you, friends. Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. Thank you.